I want to start by saying how honored and humbled I am to be here as part of this afternoon's presentation, and to be in the presence of a new friend and a not so new friend, still fairly new. The Tweety one on my left is Robert Jan van Pelt, a distinguished scholar of the Holocaust, and to my right is Pinchas Guter, who has a personal history that's going to take us into deeply into some of the things that we're talking about. And I'm going to start this off by telling you a little bit about my story as a journalist and how I came to be here and what the connection we hope we'll find among the three of us. So I'll start, as we like to do, with a story. For those of you who are interested in the larger context of this story, if you Google my name, Jeremy Gerard, and the name of Benjamin Mermelstein, M-U-R-M-E-L-S-T-E-I-N, you'll come to a New York Times piece that I wrote last year about Claude Lanzmann's film called The Last of the Unjust, which was about Benjamin Mermelstein. And I'm going to give you a little précis of that now. This is the story of the elder and the filmmaker. Benjamin Mermelstein was a brilliant Viennese rabbi and publisher who eventually became the third and final head of the Council of Elders at Theresienstadt. Unlike his predecessors, Jacob Edelstein and Dr. Paul Epstein, who were murdered when their usefulness to the Nazis had ended, Mermelstein survived. And many agreed with the great Kabbalist historian Gershom Scholem that Mermelstein should be hanged as a collaborator along with Eichmann. Claude Lanzmann is a French-born intellectual. He is an intimate of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, perhaps the seminal Holocaust documentary Shoah. During the course of filming Shoah, in fact at the very beginning, he came across Benjamin Mermelstein in Rome in 1975. Mermelstein was living there in self-imposed exile. One of the first people he tracked down had been Mermelstein, and he spent a week interviewing him in Rome. And I think, like most people, Lanzmann went into these interviews thinking very skeptically about Mermelstein, thinking that people in Theresienstadt who called him Mermelstein, Mermel the pig, were right, that he had been a collaborator, that he had been responsible for brutality and death. But he came out at the end of the week a very changed person, and that's what my article was about. He in fact, when he put together Shoah, Mermelstein was nowhere to be seen. He's not in that film. And it wasn't until many, many years later, when some of the footage of his interviews with Mermelstein began to be seen, that Lanzmann realized he needed to have some closure on this subject, and he eventually made the film that was released just last year called The Last of the Unjust, which was Mermelstein's name for himself. And it's a remarkable film. I'm going to read you a little bit from the piece about why this confrontation between this filmmaker and this rabbi was so fascinating. Mermelstein is a brilliant actor. He's got a very fast mind, and he's ready he's really ready for Lanzmann. And in the film, Lanzmann asked Mermelstein, "Were you acting to save the ghetto or to save yourself?" And Mermelstein responds, "My God, you can't present things in that way. Of course I was thinking of saving the ghetto. That said, I don't claim to have been ready to sacrifice myself. Why am I the only elder who survived? Because, like Scheherazade, I told stories. The ghetto needed to be restored so the story could be told." In other words, he's saying that as we know, Theresienstadt was the quote model ghetto, and was the subject of a complete false makeover to get it ready for inspection by the International Red Cross and for a propaganda film that was going to be made about just how terrific things were in this camp. And later, there's a fantastic interchange in the film between Mermelstein and Landsman. They're talking, they come upon the subject of Gershom Scholem, whom both of them knew. Mermelstein had published Gershom Scholem in Vienna, and because Scholem was a part of the European intelligentsia, Landsman knew him as well. And they're walking along, and we see these two men who had started out the film as adversaries. And Landsman says, Gershom Scholem thought and wrote that Mermelstein deserved to be hanged by the Jewish people. And Mermelstein says, where Scholem is concerned, my dear friend, and I hope you don't mind me calling you dear friend, it's just a matter of speaking. And Landsman says, oh, I hope it's not just a matter of speaking. You can already see what's going on between them. Mermelstein says, Scholem is a great scholar. 40 years ago, I published a history of the Jews. At the time, he was still called Gerhard Scholem, and I wrote in the introduction that the works of Gerhard Scholem allowed for an entirely new approach to certain assessments of Jewish history. I haven't changed my opinion. He is a very great scholar. I would even say that I compare him to Sigmund Freud, a flattering comparison. Sigmund Freud was certainly a great man, one of the greatest Jews who ever lived, but Freud, who was such an expert in medicine and psychoanalysis, ventured into the field of Bible scholarship, and he wrote Total Stupidity about Moses. Similarly, Gerhard Scholem, an expert on Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, wanted to write on contemporary history, and he talked rubbish about Mermelstein. I could also say that, but I don't. But I'll say it to you, a great scholar like him, with his scientific approach, owes it to himself to do research. There's plenty of research on Mermelstein. The Red Cross archives, the Rahm trial, the Mermelstein trial, and even closer to us, the Eichmann trial. I should have mentioned that after the war, the Czech authorities arrested Mermelstein and were going to prosecute him as a collaborator, and after 6 months of investigation decided there was none or not enough evidence to prosecute, and he was exonerated. In their eyes, not in the eyes of many Jews. Mermelstein goes on, if one builds up the character of Mermelstein from these documents, he would have, let's say, Gerhard Scholem should have reconsidered before wanting me hanged. Moreover, I don't understand why Eichmann was sentenced to death. Why, when Eichmann was sentenced to death, Scholem was one of the ones who protested against his execution. And he wanted me executed, although I was exonerated. The gentleman is a little capricious with hanging, don't you think? So I'd like to start the discussion of these remarkable figures and how they, in some ways, encapsulate the whole idea of the incredibly complex and still 60 years on, very, very raw subject of Jewish collaboration with the Nazis. By talking with my friend Pinchas and asking him to tell another story. And I'll tell you a little bit about Pinchas. Between his birth in, I'm going to say Lodz, is that okay? Lodz? I don't know why it's spelled L-O-D-Z and pronounced Lodz, but between his birth in Lodz, Poland, and your liberation by the Soviet army from Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, you were sent to the Warsaw Ghetto. You lost your entire family to the murderers at Majdanek, survived a work camp and internment at a second death camp, Buchenwald, and then a death march from Germany south to Theresienstadt. All this before reaching the age of bar mitzvah. And during all that time, You witnessed the participation of fellow Jews in the horrors that were unfolding before your child's eyes. My question, Pinchas, is when did you become aware that at least some aspect of your tribulations were expedited by Jews? You also had the experience of Mermelstein, and so perhaps you can tell us about your experience at Theresienstadt, and specifically about the role played by Mermelstein and the Judenrat there. And we can even go back to, I haven't spoken about Mermelstein's beginnings in Vienna and his collaboration with Eichmann well before he went to Theresienstadt. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about your experience.
So what's the new stuff?
No, I was going to start with you.
Well, okay. I hope you can all hear me. I like speaking without a microphone, and hopefully you can all hear me. Can you hear me or not? I find the microphone constrains me, and because of my voice carries, it's much easier for me to do so. Well, basically, what I'm going to do is I'm not a scholar, and I've never been to university, and I haven't been to school, so I can't speak to you from a scholarly perspective, but I can only tell you from my own personal experiences. So I would like to tell you that I was in Warsaw until the uprising approximately 3.5 years. The first year, approximately till the end of November of 1940, there was no ghetto, you could move around easily, and after that there was a closed-in ghetto, and I was there all this time until the uprising, and then 3 weeks into the uprising I was sent to the death camp Majdanek. So, in the Warsaw ghetto, we had a Judenrat, a Jewish community, I call them Jewish community councils. I don't call them the elders of the Jews because to me it's the Jewish community council. And the Jewish community council set up an infrastructure, of course, what they were told by the Germans. So we had a Jewish police, we had a Jewish post office, we had dairy workers, we had hospitals, doctors, we had a whole kind of, almost like self-governing little city, except we couldn't do anything except what we were told by the Nazis on a daily basis. They would come to Chernyakov, the engineer who was the head of the Judenrat, of the community council, and the regulations would come furious and fast and furious from him. Now, another thing is that, so we had the Jewish police, and the Jewish police had special hats, and they had a blue band around their heads, and they had, depending if they were just a constable or an officer, they had little buttons or stars, and they had a special band around there, apart from the ordinary that everybody had to wear if you were over 12 years old, with a buggenduvit and a white armband. They had special armbands with showing what they were, and they were just the ordinary police. And they were guarding the gates, they were guarding the prisons. We had a prison inside the ghetto, so they were guarding the prison. They did everything that the police should be doing. But we also had the Czenastka. Now, Czenastka was, the reason why it's called Czenastka was because Czenaście in Polish is number 13. And number 13 Leszno Street were the headquarters of the Jewish Gestapo. Now, it's very interesting for somebody who was there to tell you that there was a Jewish Gestapo. But there was a Jewish Gestapo. And they had special hats, and their hats were more or less the same as the Jewish police, but they had green bands around, the band around the head was green, and we all knew it. And they were, according to officially, they were supposed to fight black market, all kinds of things. They were supposed to be a kind of guardian angel. But in actual fact, they were the smugglers. They cooperated with the Nazi Gestapo. They had very close connections with them. They controlled a lot of the black market. And I'll say a few words about that later. They controlled the black market. And the most horrible thing they did is they knew Jews who had go and they would tell the Gestapo who they were, or they would extort from them before telling the Gestapo. They would go to them, listen, we know you've got lots of diamonds and lots of gold and you're very wealthy, so if you don't give us some of that wealth that you've squirreled away, we are going to hand you over to the Gestapo, and of course then you lose everything. So this was, so basically you had a Jewish Gestapo. I'm talking about collaborations. I'm not talking about my own personal experiences. I'm talking about collaboration. I'll give you an idea about what it is. And they were, to my mind, they were collaborating with the Gestapo. What is actually very troubling is that at the same time that they were collaborating with the Gestapo, they also did a lot of good work. For example, they would have every Friday, they would invite Hasidic Jews and have a table where they would feed them. So much so that the chief cantor of the Tvomatsky synagogue, the big synagogue, it was very famous worldwide cantor, his son was involved with the Chinastica. And during the deportations, there are some very terrible stories about the behavior of to save themselves, what actually happened. So this is, whatever they were before was brought out the worst in them while they were in the ghetto, you know, as police. They were also trying to extort things. For example, they would work together. When you went out, you see, that's the problem. You have to kind of get involved. When you try, in the beginning, you could go out from the Warsaw Ghetto. You could actually get special permission where you worked on the other side. You know, I'm talking about beginning of 1941 and so forth and so on, end of 40-41. So they would work together with the gendarmes and the Polish police. There was the blue police, the Policja Granatowa. They would work with them together, and by bribery and corruption, they would allow all kinds of things. So there was a lot of bribery and corruption going on with the Jewish police, apart from the Chinastica. And they were almost, in a way, despite the fact that the police were subject to the community council, they became almost a organ of their own, and they did whatever they wanted. The head of the police was a converted Jew who, before the war, was a colonel in the Polish police, in the general police before the war. So this is a situation, and I'll come back to the ghetto, and I'll come back to that. And now let me come to my own personal experiences in the concentration camps. One of the concentration camps that I was Skarżysko-Kamienne. In that concentration camp, the head of the internal administration was Jewish police and Jewish administration. The head of the administration was a woman called Markovichova. And she, because she was allowed to bring in her mother and her children, her husband, and Markovichova used to wear a white coat, and she had a whip, and she was quite capable from time to time to designate. We had selections of people who couldn't work anymore, because this was a terrible camp, where people who lasted 3-4 months maximum through terrible, chemicals that used to go through your body. They used to attack your lungs and liver. You became yellow, and then you died within 3 months. And also people from starvation, from typhoid. So there were selections. And she would actually designate who could live and who could not live. So this was Markovichova. So she was, and she used to be on very good terms with the Ukrainian. Most of our guards were Ukrainians, but we also had our commander was an Austrian policeman, inspector from Vienna. He wasn't an SS, he was an inspector from Vienna, served the First World War, and gave him a special sinecure to be a commander of a so-called non-death camp, but there was a book written about this Werkse where I was, and it's called "The Death Comes in Yellow" from the picric acid, and in Yiddish, I don't think the book, the Yiddish book about it, which the Death Comes in Yellow is based on, it was called in the Fabriken von Tod, in the factories of death, because, you know, it didn't last very long. So there you had Markovichova with her cohorts, and there was a woman who was in charge of the magazine. I think she was a family of hers, but she appointed her the charge of the clothing magazine. And they used to bring clothes to there, so for people. The only difference was that unless you had a special protection, in other words, unless you could give her something or something like that, you wouldn't get anything. So for example, I was most of the time in rags, and when my first shoes were worn out, which I came from Majdanek, I had paper and wire, and you can imagine in Poland it gets very cold. You know, you have winter, you have snow, you get -10, -20, it's very, very cold. So and you used to pack paper around us. But when we went to the magazine and asked them for some clothing, you couldn't get it unless somebody, you know, who was, you know, so this was another thing. Then I was transformed to a camp called Żelazna Huta in Częstochowa. The commander of that camp, internal camp, was a Jew. His name was Frankel. And he organized the camp in such a way, we never saw a guard, we never saw a assessment, we had some Jewish policemen in the camp, and nobody was beaten. We had very good food. I mean, food, considering, you know, what kind of food we got in Skarżysko, we had food that we could live on. We worked hard. We worked in the ironworks like Hamilton, but we worked 12 hours, but we used to get food. And to give you an example, that when winter was coming, he got some tailors in the camp to cut up blankets and sew for the young people, sew up coats so that we shouldn't freeze from the cold.
Remind us now, you're 10 years old at this point?
No, I was going on 13 already. This is 1944. And so this is Frankel. So he was cooperating. You know, I make a difference between collaborating and cooperating. He was cooperating with the Nazis by running this camp, but he was doing it in such a way that you can't imagine a youngster had appendix, an appendix which was inflamed, and he was in terrible pain. He arranged for the ambulance to come to take him to the hospital in Częstochowa, the Polish Christian hospital. He was operated, he was brought back to the camp, he recovered, and he was quite well. Now this is unheard of, because in Skarżysko, somebody who had an appendix, you know, Markovichova would have seen that he would be shot. He would be taken to the Strzelnica, the firing range at the back there, and he would be killed, because he wasn't anymore worthy of work. When I got to Buchenwald, Buchenwald was in chaos. This was the end of 1944. There was no food, nothing, there was no work. We used to have barracks without heating. It was winter. We were 1,000 in a barrack. Every morning when they had a roll call, we would come out of the roll call, we would come out, there would be, you know, whoever was alive, and next to us were all the bodies of the dead people that died at night, and usually about 30 or 40 people were dead, and everybody was counted, and then they were carted off to the crematorium. But what I'm going to try and tell you is this: by that time, the internal administration of that camp was in the hands of German communists, because there was always a struggle between the criminal elements in the German camps, and even in Majdanek, and the left-wing communists. And they managed to get hold of, they became the internal administration. And they tried very hard, bringing some potatoes, some food, try and get, especially for the younger people, to give us some food. So these were also, in the sense, you could say they were cooperating with the Nazis. They were running the camp, the internal administration of the camp, but at the same time they tried their best to alleviate, you know, situations. And what's more, they also became judges, because when we arrived in the camp, they wanted to know from us who were the terrible people that, you know, were in charge of you, who were the bad ones, who were the ones who were killing you, who were the ones who were, you know, amongst Kapos and others. And those that were actually you know, pointed out, were beaten to death in Buchenwald, sometimes unjustly, because unfortunately somebody had it in for Frankel, and when we arrived in Buchenwald, they pointed him out that he was a commander of the camp, and he was murdered in that camp. So basically, you know, what I'm trying to do is show you the different aspects of what was happening. And then I would just like to finish off with the question of Rumkovsky, who was the head of the elders in Łódź, and Czerniaków, who was the head of the Judenrat in Warsaw. When the Nazis came to Czerniaków in 1942 in July, just before and they told him that they're going to take the children, he decided that he wasn't going to hand over the children to die, because he knew exactly what was happening. And he committed suicide. The only thing he didn't do, which he should have done, he should have actually made placards and say, look, this resettlement is not going to go to the east. It said resettlement, you know, everybody's going to go and die. He didn't do that, but at least he couldn't face what he wasn't prepared to deliver to the Germans, you know, children. In Łódź, Rumkovsky, when he was approached to give the children, he made a big speech, and he actually, it's called, you know, you read it today, it's give me your children. He was prepared to take the children and send them to death. Now, in the Holocaust, in the times of the Holocaust, which was an apocalyptic inferno as far as I'm concerned, I leave it to you to decide. I've just told you a few things about what was going on there. It's for you to think and decide how one can decide who was what and why. For example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Chinastka did a lot of smuggling. Food was very scarce. If you hadn't been for the smuggling, more and more people would have died, because there was, you could, if you had some even clothes, you could actually sell it and buy extra bread. So how did that happen? They also distributed food amongst religious Jews. Rumkovsky, people can say, as far as Rumkovsky in Łódź is concerned, that a lot of Jews in Łódź survived because although they were sent to Auschwitz after the war, and what's more, everything that was written about Łódź, all the lists and all the documents, you know, were saved because the ghetto lasted to the end of 1944. So I am personally, I am not prepared to judge people and say, look, this was a collaborator, this was not a collaborator. As far as I'm concerned, I think it is impossible, if you, especially if you were there, to be able, in that inferno, to be able to decide for your, I think historically you can point out things, but the Holocaust was such an unbelievable situation where you couldn't really, you can't, it's difficult to judge people. Some people, of course, were really bad, and they were collaborators. And those collaborators, if they were caught, I believe they should have been judged in a criminal court. And, you know, I don't believe in the death penalty. I'm against the death penalty. I would have locked them up for the rest of their life, you know, because they were guilty of horrible things like Markovichova. She did not survive. She was murdered by the Nazis. And that's a long story, but
before you sit down, I do want to ask you about Mermelstein, who you had very strong feelings about.
Well, I had, yeah. You see, it's very difficult for me to say. I had strong feelings. I had strong feelings about the film that Claude Lanzmann made about Mermelstein. I didn't have strong feelings about Mermelstein himself, because number one, when I got to Theresienstadt, it was 3 weeks before the end of the war. I had no experience of Mermelstein personally, except, you know, I heard people talking about them in the ghetto. I was there for the next 3 months, you know, until I was shipped out to England. But so I didn't have anything personal involved, but I had a visceral reaction to the way he was treated by Claude Lanzmann, because I felt that with the history that you know, that he had behind him, you know, collaborating, as far as I'm concerned, with Eichmann, already going back in Vienna before the Second World War, I felt that he should have really been put in front of a panel of judges, and everything should have been and he should have been judged. But that's why my visceral reaction was not to Mermelstein, it was to the film of Mermelstein, of Claude Lanzmann of Mermelstein.
Thank you, thank you. Robert Jan, you are, of course, familiar with the phrase, the architecture of the Holocaust. And that's a phrase that I find fascinating for its dual meaning, the theoretical structure of genocide and the plan to make Europe Judenrein, and the pragmatic application of manpower, machinery, and I'll call it marketing, to pursue that agenda. Specifically, you're the world's leading expert on the construction of history's most efficient mass murder machine, Auschwitz-Birkenau, of course. So my first question to you, and I think probably the most sensitive, is could the architecture of the Holocaust have happened? Could it have been successful without the help of Jewish collaborators? And my second question will be, as to the story of Benjamin Mermelstein illustrates the popular perception of collaboration, as well as the judgments of historians, has evolved through distinct phases over the 60 years since liberation. And I was hoping that you would give us an overview of that changing historical perspective.
Yes, thanks very much. I would like to start actually by connecting to the last two sentences Pinchas spoke. Mermelstein should have been put before a court, before judges, and he should have been judged. It's interesting that Mermelstein himself in the movie actually says something about that. He says, an elder of the Jews can be condemned. In fact, he must be condemned because he cannot be judged, because one cannot take his place. It's a very interesting observation. He cannot be judged. And so Mermelstein himself, when he talks about, first of all, his arrest in 1945 on the 6th of May, one day after Theresienstadt was liberated, he says that he voluntarily put himself at the disposal of the Soviet authorities. Voluntarily. And then when he talks about his self-imposed exile in Rome after the war, he says that he calls himself the last of the unjust. And he takes up really the idea which you find in Isaiah of the servant of God, who takes upon himself the sins of the world, which then the Christians, of course, translate in the figure of Christ, who dies on behalf of humanity. And so he sees himself that, yes, he accepts punishment. He basically has sentenced himself, but he denies us, that is historians or judges, the ability to judge him, because none of us could ever imagine what it is to be an elder of the Jews. And hence we cannot judge
compares himself to Sancho Panza, and he says, everybody else was tilting at windmills and I was making it possible.
Yeah, he uses a number of metaphors. But in any case, so on the judgment. Now, of course, the problem with the architecture of the Holocaust, and you raised this, I mean, metaphorically, the architecture of the Holocaust, you raised this, it is, of course, the idea of Jewish collaboration. Now, normally what happens in a genocide, for example, the genocide of the Poles in 1939, this was a genocide, it was not a Holocaust, but a genocide. And what the Germans did, they walk into Poland and they start decapitating the Polish nation. They start imprisoning and killing the leadership. That's what you normally do. When you want to kill a population, a nation, you start by removing the elite. And then you have a kind of formless mass of people, and you can do with them what you want, because the whole idea is that the elite in some way can organize resistance to your policy of genocide, and without an elite, the people cannot organize themselves. So they are going to be fully subject to your policies. And of course, the remarkable thing about the Holocaust is that in the history of genocide, if we now take the Holocaust as part of the history of genocide, It's unique in many different ways, but one of the ways it's unique is that Germans did not do that. In fact, what they did is exactly the opposite. They empowered the elites. Not necessarily always the pre-war elite. Sometimes new people were brought into a position of power, like Rumkowski and Łódź, who was not part really of the pre-war Jewish elite in that city. But the fact that the Germans created an elite and that they worked through the elite and gave them absolute power over the Jewish community is a novum in history. And that makes, of course, the Jewish councils very interesting, not only when we look at what happened to the Jews, but actually when we look at what happens to persecution in general or to genocide in general. Now, why are the Jewish councils such a source of incredible pain, confusion, anger still today? And I will just talk a little bit about, I want to start with a quote by Primo Levi, the beginning of his essay called The Grey Zone, which is probably still the most important reflection on the topic. And he talks about himself as a survivor of Auschwitz. Have we who have returned, been able to understand and make others understand our experience? What we commonly mean by understand coincides with simplify. Without a profound simplification, the world around us would be infinite, undefined tangle that would defy our ability to orient ourselves and decide upon our actions. In short, we are compelled to reduce the knowable to a scheme. With this purpose in view, we have built for ourselves admirable tools in the course of evolution, tools which are the specific property of the human species, language and conceptual thought. We also tend to simplify history, but a pattern within which events are ordered is not always identifiable in a single, unequivocal fashion, and therefore different historians may understand and construe history in ways that are incompatible with one another. Nevertheless, perhaps for reasons that go back to our origins as social animals, the need to divide the field into we and they is so strong that this pattern, this bipartition, friend versus enemy, prevails over all others. Popular history, and also the history taught in schools, is influenced by this Manichaean tendency which shuns half-tints and complexities. It is prone to reduce the river of human occurrences to conflicts, and the conflicts to duels. We and they, Athenians and Spartans, Romans and Carthaginians. This is certainly the reason for the enormous popularity of spectator sports, such as soccer, baseball and boxing. The contenders are two teams or two individuals, clearly distinct and identifiable, and at the end of the match they are vanquished and victors. If the result is a draw, the spectator feels defrauded and disappointed. At the more or less unconscious level, he wanted winners and losers, which he identified as the good guys and the bad guys, respectively, because the good must prevail, otherwise the world would be subverted. The desire for simplification is justified, but the same does not always apply to simplification itself, which is a working hypothesis, useful as long as it's recognized as such and not mistaken for reality. The greater part of historical and natural phenomena are not simple, or not simple in the way we would like. Now, the network of human relationships inside the lagers was not simple. And then he starts to talk about the incredible shock he has when he arrives in Auschwitz, and he's prepared for this idea that the guards are there and that inside there are the prisoners and they are going to show mutual solidarity. And he realizes that in the camp itself there are informers, there are the capos, that in fact this whole idea of them and us doesn't exist in the camp, which of course by implication is also what happened in the ghettos, and where we then come to the Jewish councils. Now it's very clear that most Jews survived in the ghettos, who survived the ghettos and survived the camps, because ultimately they, one way or another, accommodated themselves also to the elites in the camps and the ghettos. I mean, that's clear. I mean, these were people with power over life and death. However, when we come to 1945 and we basically talk about the survivors who come out of the Holocaust, what we see is an incredible rage against the capos, against the Jewish councils, against the eldest of the prisoners in the camps. Incredible rage. And of course, you can basically go to Freud, you can go to psychologists to try to explain that. You know, that many people come out of this event with what is then called survivor guilt, and I don't want to go in that, but that they need a scapegoat. And that in some way the Jewish councils and the capos were convenient scapegoat, because they in some way had transgressed that boundary, which is re-established in 1944 in the imagination of them and us, the Nazis and the Jews. And that while during the Holocaust that boundary had been blurred, that after the war it needed to be re-established in the collective memory. And there, of course, the question is, where is the Jewish Council to be? Where are you located in relationship to that boundary? Are on this side or the other side? And that generally the survivor community decided that they were on the other side. So in Israel in 1950, immediately after the establishment of the state, a law is passed that actually allows for the prosecution of Nazi criminals, but also for Jewish collaborators. Immediately, and it's only used until Eichmann to actually prosecute Jews who collaborated with the Nazis. But they're seen exactly as the same. Their victim status, the fact that they were also victims, or maybe primarily victims, was not important in the Israeli legislation. So we're dealing with, in the first 10 years, you can say, with a very visceral condemnation. And in some way, it is you can trace it, there's no theoretical work done at all, no study made of these Jewish councils or collaborators, but everyone condemns them. Then we get, around 1960, we get two very important...
Was there a political motivation for that, do you think?
Now, I think the political motivation was that the only way to move on is to actually make things simple. That the burden of collaboration was too large to be dealt with.
It's what you were saying at the beginning, that we need to simplify to understand.
Yeah, you need to actually establish again a course. And, you know, if you're looking at, I mean, if the country where I come from, almost every survivor at a certain moment had a relationship to the Jewish Council. You know, some kind of protection early on when the deportations were granted on. Who were deported? These were the poor Jews who had no connections. Yeah, it were the middle class and wealthier Jews who were able to get exemptions from deportations for enough time to find out a place to hide, or they then arrived later in Auschwitz and had greater chances. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, a Holocaust is a very messy thing. Yeah? So, what happened was that the first time that this was put in theoretical perspective was really in the mid-50s. Adler, the history of the Theresienstadt camp was written by a survivor, and he basically judges Mermelstein and all of the elders of the Theresienstadt ghetto very, very harshly. I mean, for them, they are just on the other side. They are like Nazis. It's very clear. Then in 1960 appears what is basically the book that establishes Holocaust history as its own discipline. This is The Destruction of the European Jews by Raoul Hilberg. And Raoul Hilberg basically tries to understand the structure of destruction, the architecture of destruction, studying mainly German sources, and he makes it very clear that the Jewish councils are an integral part of the machinery of destruction.
Indeed, it was Landsman reading Hilberg that resulted in his doing his first interview with Mermelstein.
Yeah. So this is Hilberg is here. We have a picture of him here. He's a political scientist. He's not a historian. Kind of important to know. Political scientist. He looks actually at the politics of it, and he said that without the Jewish councils, the Germans would not have killed as many. Yeah, this is basically this is a very harsh judgment on the Jewish councils. So they were an essential part of the German architecture of destruction. Now, not many people read Hilberg at the time. The book, it is buried, his judgment is buried in a very difficult to read book. But then we get the Eichmann trial, and then Hannah Arendt comes along. Hannah Eichmann, I mean, listen to me. I'm a great admirer of her. I absolutely love Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt comes along and writes for the New Yorker a series of articles which becomes this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, which appears in 1963. She basically bases her understanding of the Jewish councils, because Eichmann in his trial says, you know, okay, you may condemn me, but you know, I had all these Jews who worked with me. I can't have been that bad. Yeah, and of course brings the Jewish councils as a part of his defense, or his lawyer does. And then Hannah Arendt comes along and then writes her section on the Jewish councils starts with the following sentence. To a Jew, this role of the Jewish leaders in the destruction of their own people is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. And then she starts analyzing on the basis of the evidence presented in the Eichmann trial, which she interprets through the perspective of Hilberg. She remains very close to Hilberg. And then at a certain moment, she talks how the issue of cooperation and collaboration is dealt with in the Eichmann trial. And the matter of cooperation was twice mentioned by the judges. Or in general, Hausner, the prosecutor, doesn't want to go there, because he wants to create a very clear idea. You have the Nazis on the one side and the Jews on the other side. Perpetrators, victims. I mean, that's in the interest also of the Israeli prosecution at the time. And Hannah Arendt doesn't buy it. The matter of cooperation was twice mentioned by the judges. Judge Yitzhak Rave elicited from one of the resistant witnesses an admission that the ghetto police were an instrument in the hands of murderers, and an acknowledgement of the Judenrat's policy of cooperating with the Nazis. And Judge Halevi found out from Eichmann in cross-examination that the Nazis had regarded this cooperation as the very cornerstone of their Jewish policy. But the question the prosecutor regularly addressed to each witness, except the resistance fighters, which sounded so very natural to those who knew nothing of the factual background of the trial, the question, why did you not rebel, actually served as a smokescreen for the question that was not asked. And thus it came to pass that all answers to the unanswerable question Mr. Hausner, the prosecutor, put to his witnesses were considerably less than the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. True, it was that the Jewish people as a whole had not been organized, that they had possessed no territory, no government, and no army, that in the hour of their greatest need they had no government in exile to represent among the allies, no caches of weapons, no youth with military training. But the whole truth was that there existed Jewish community organizations and Jewish party and welfare organizations on both the local and the international level. Wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders, and this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis. The whole truth was that if the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people. Now this is published in the New Yorker and then in this book in 1963, and it just opens the question. You know, now the Jewish Council has come right at the center of basically our understanding of the Holocaust. The Nazis are the Nazis. I mean, they're in some way they're not the problem. But now Hannah Arendt, who is a very well-known philosopher and political scientist, says, if it wasn't for the Jewish councils, the number of victims would have been considerably less. So now the question is, of course, and she Gershom Scholem not only wants to her Mergelstein, she immediately says to Hannah Arendt, this you shouldn't say, a daughter of Israel should not say things like that. It may be true, but you shouldn't say things like that. And friendship of 40 years is immediately broken off. Hannah Arendt is absolutely thrown out of the Jewish community. A recent movie called Hannah shows this very well. I mean, she's ostracized because, of course, this is unbearable. This is totally unbearable. Yeah. So now the question is, how does basically the scholarship and the Jewish community move from that position? We are now in this great confusion in the early 60s, and this is not really the time yet that we have really what we call Holocaust history, Holocaust scholarship. There are really no Holocaust scholars yet. In some way, the person who saves today is Jesaja Truk. This is a book that is sponsored. He was born in Poland. He has a degree from the University of Warsaw in history, and then goes to work for Kiever. And Kiever in New York basically decides that they need to take ownership of this question. And they commission him to basically do the big study. So this comes out of this. The book is with footnotes 664 pages. And it is published in the early 70s. There is a preface by Jacob Robinson, who's the most prominent kind of Jewish international lawyer at the time. He's argued in the 20s and 30s at the League of Nations for Jewish minority rights. He's everywhere. I mean, for World Jewish Congress and so on. And he writes a preface. Now, what Trunk does is he does something that Arendt hadn't done and that Hilberg hadn't done. Is that he actually says, where do these Jewish councils come from? And what he says is, in fact, these Jewish councils are in a state of continuity with the Jewish community structures before the Holocaust. Yeah, they are basically you have them in Holland, you have them in Poland, whatever. Like the Jewish autonomy it always created, or always had been Jewish leadership that had relatively large powers over the Jewish population. So first of all, what he does is he creating foundations under the idea of these Jewish councils. And he starts comparing the power these Jewish councils had in the extraordinary, unprecedented situation of the Holocaust to the powers they had over Jews before. And he starts to see those continuities. The second thing is that what he starts to do is what Pinchas just did for us. He starts actually to look at every situation in its own context. He doesn't generalize anymore, as Hannah Arendt had done, but he starts to look, what was the council like in Warsaw? How does it compare to the council in Kovno? How does it compare to the council in Łódź? How does it compare to the council in Częstochowa and Amsterdam and so on? And he starts to see that there actually is an enormous amount of variations on the way this council operated. He also starts to look in the difference between when the council operates in the period before deportations, when basically lives are not directly at risk, and once the deportations begin, when the councils get involved in making up lists, decide who's going to be on the train to Auschwitz or not. And so he starts also to make temporal distinctions in the work of these councils. And his conclusion is that it didn't make a difference. So if I basically now quote the judgment by Robinson, this is the final summary of the book in one sentence. It would appear then that when all factors are considered, Jewish participation or non-participation in the deportations had no substantial influence, one way or the other, on the final outcome of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. So this is where we are now in the mid-1970s. And Trunk in some way takes ownership of the question. The Jewish councils now start to disappear out of the the front line, and then Yad Vashem organizes in the late 70s a very large conference on Jewish leadership during the Holocaust, and basically confirms by all kind of case studies Trunk's kind of judgment. Finally, then, by the 1980s, one of the things that become of great interest now also to many is actually the idea of behavior, rational behavior and not so on. So that for the first time people actually start to simulate their experiments, like the Milgram experiments already in the 60s, that people start to actually now try to see how does actually rationality, models of the way we act in the world, how actually are these illuminated by the dilemmas and questions the Jewish Council had. And there then Zygmunt Bauman, a Jewish, Polish, English sociologist, makes an enormous contribution in what is the book that really started the whole debate, Modernity and the Holocaust, which was published in 1989, and which I think is one of the great works on the Holocaust. And he has a whole chapter on the Jewish councils. The reason that he is interested in the Jewish councils, he thinks that Trunk has settled the issue sufficiently. You know, we do not have to immediately say Jewish council, evil, 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 evil. Yeah, Jewish collaboration, cooperation also help Jews. But what he's interested in is to understand in some way the rationality that was at work when the leaders of a Jewish council made decisions. What did they see was happening? How actually did they respond to what was happening? And he develops out of that quite an interesting theory, which he sees as being problematic, in fact, for all of us today, in late modernity. And out of that then comes a new debate, and that basically is a debate. There's a German Israeli historian, Dan Diner, who then says that basically what we see the limits of rationality at work in the options the Jewish Council had, and in the way they basically on rational grounds always made the wrong decision in some way. It wasn't because they were stupid, it wasn't because they were evil, but there was actually a drift apart between what in this case, what Bauman calls the rationality of the actor, that is the person who makes the decision, and the rationality of the action. And he says what happens is that these people who made decisions in the Jewish councils were all very rational in their decisions, but the decision itself had a different rationality, the implication. And he creates a theoretical work around it, which is, you know, quite abstract. And other historians start working with this. Now, if we look where we are today, we basically are now, if we talk about Jewish councils, why they're interested, we are still in the age created by Bauman. Basically, I checked Yad Vashem, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, just to give you their position right now on their websites. So first Yad Vashem, Jewish council set up in the Jewish communities of Nazi-occupied Europe on German orders, and given the responsibility to implement the Nazis' policies regarding the Jews. These Jewish councils often performed a balancing act. On one hand, they felt a responsibility to help their fellow Jews as much as possible. On the other, they were supposed to carry out the orders of the Nazi authorities, often at the expense of their fellow Jews, which means they don't come on either side. The Holocaust Museum puts it the same thing slightly differently. The members of the Jewish councils faced impossible moral dilemmas. Often forgotten in the debates over the culpability of the Jewish councils and the Jewish police are the efforts of many Jewish council members and officials in their employ to provide a variety of social, economic and cultural services under the brutal and difficult conditions in the ghettos. Which means that on the one side, what the Holocaust Museum does, it looks at the structural issue of the police and the councils, and on the other hand you have the individual members of the council, the individual members of the police, which I think again is something that Pinchas referred to. That's where we are today with that question.
So my first question to both of you is, I don't want to be too reductive, but on the one hand we have the notion of the participants in the Judenrat were forced, and were therefore we blame the victims, which might be a way of characterizing Hannah Arendt's thesis, which of course you know has come under tremendous criticism within just the last year. Much of what she reported is being challenged, and her conclusions are being challenged.
No, actually 63 they were challenged, but
Yeah.
now they're challenged on different grounds.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right. So are we blaming the victims, or as Pinchas so eloquently put it, do we take each one measure by measure for the actions of individuals? And if we're going to do that, doesn't that lead us to the same place? Because we are seeing that in some circumstances, leaders were willing to give their lives when pushed to a certain point. So it makes it clear to us that others weren't, that others were, as Mermelstein says, well, I wasn't going to stop thinking about myself, of course. So it's hard to be reductive about this issue because it's so complex.
I think the one thing that we haven't kind of taken into consideration is the devilish cleverness of the Nazis, the way they controlled both the Judenrat, the population, by their, ways of fooling everybody. They did it in such a way, for example, and I've told this in my story, and that is that when the deportation started in the Warsaw Ghetto, the placards didn't say that everybody, that 500,000 Jews, well, there weren't 500, 100,000 that died, from disease and illness in the ghetto by that time. But there were 350 or close like that, people who, they weren't all going to be deported. It said that certain classes are going to be deported, people that didn't have work, people that did this and did that and the others, and they distributed all kinds of different documents. So first you had red documents, and then the red documents became invalid, and then they had green documents, so like people had red documents, and they would surround half a dozen blocks of streets, and then they would chase everybody down, and people would come with their red documents and say, look, we are exempt because, we've got these red documents, we're working. No, red documents are not valid anymore, And these red documents were obviously issued originally by the Judenrat because they were asked to issue those documents. Then became green documents. In the end, there were tags for those people that were employed in turbans in the factories of the Germans that were in the ghetto and outside the ghetto. So there was this, in a way, there was this kind of continuous fooling the population that believed in that they are going to be saved. And when this didn't work, and the question about Hannah Arendt, I read Hannah Arendt when the book was published many years ago, and you cannot imagine my reaction to it, because I remember that in the Warsaw Ghetto, it wasn't a question of the Jewish police. The Jewish police, right from the beginning, couldn't, a lot of them weren't prepared to do it at, what they were told to do. So then they were given, you've got to bring five victims to the stations. If you don't bring 5 victims to the station, then we're going to take your family out because your family is safe. Of course, that was also a ruse, something which wasn't going to be true, which wasn't true, because afterwards most of them were taken to the cemetery and shot in the cemetery or deported, and their numbers were dwindling and dwindling. But it's the way that the human being operates, that is in such dire circumstances, everybody tries to save themselves first. My father, he wasn't a participant, he wasn't anything, he just knew he had to hide his family. So right through the deportations, we were hidden everywhere that he could find a place for us, whether in attics, behind false walls, behind iron doors, in a bunker eventually. So he was hiding us, trying to protect us. So everybody tried to do whatever they can. And some people believed the Nazis, that if they do what they tell them to do, they will be saved. So there was this kind of games that they played. They're continuous games. And when it came that there were no Jewish police and there was nobody, and there was still hundreds of thousands of Jews, they created what they called the Kochel, which was in September. It was, I only remember it as Yom Kippur because it was Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur time. But they surrounded most of the ghetto and chased everybody down. It was only Ukrainian and mainly Ukrainian and German SS. And the police were just there to to collect the dead bodies that they were shooting all the time. Like if you saw Schindler's List, you saw that when they were having these chasing people down, they were shooting them and killing them on the spot. So it is very difficult for me to go and say, look, this, that, or the other. The situation was such that I believe that you cannot really, there were some people, like the head policeman, the Jewish policeman who ran the Umschlagplatz, who was a complete and utter murderer, and he used to, there was, you know, I got to go into it, there was a sanitary, in the beginning, you know, the Germans play all kinds of things, so there was like a little hospital for people who weren't well when they were being deported. So there were nurses and doctors in that little Krankenstube, which is a clinic, a kind of clinic. And they had an ambulance. So there was a man, a particular man, who tried to get people out of the Umschlagplatz by dressing them as a nurse or a doctor. And this Schmerling, the policeman, would go around checking and making sure that nobody could get out so they could be sent to Treblinka. Now this was a real collaborator, and as far as I'm concerned, if he was caught, I mean he was actually killed by the Jewish resistance, but if he was caught after the war, and he should have been brought in front of a court of law, judged, locked up, and finished. That's the way I feel.
So, yeah, so let me add something maybe to add a little bit to what Pinchas said. The basic structure of the way the Germans dealt with the Jewish community in general and the Jewish council in particular was very simple. Is that whatever decision you make about the group, there's always going to be exemptions to it. And they were generally called Sperre. So a Sperre is like a beam that goes over a road. It is a barrier. So the idea is if you're going to be deported, we're going to give, 200,000 people are going to be deported, but there will be 40,000 Sperre. So everyone is running to get the Sperre. Yeah, as the red or the green or the yellow form or whatever like that. That was in some way the trick. Because everyone was always calculating how they could be in the exemption. And then, of course, then the policy changes and there's going to be new exemption, policy change, new exemption. Now, on the issue, this is a second point which I think is very important, a distinction to be made, and it's conceptually maybe a little tricky. But when we talk about governments, when we talk about bodies that represent us, the people, yeah, we have a concept that's called reasons of state. That is, that we agree that what for an individual may not be moral, might be moral for the state, or maybe that morality doesn't apply to the state. Yeah? I mean, we complain that the government lies and whatever like that, but in fact, if you really look at it, governments work on the governments mean that something that represents us and that needs to deal with other bodies that represent other people do not act on the morality according to the laws of morality by which individuals act. We have accepted that since the beginning of political theory. Since the Greeks we have accepted that. Yeah? So, when we're talking, so what does it mean, a reason of state? That is, for example, a Jewish council is established. They have the task to represent the interest of, in this case, an imprisoned Jewish population. They have to negotiate with the Germans. They cannot not negotiate with the Germans, and in their negotiation with the Germans, they can invoke, legitimately, as a result of 2,500 years of political thinking, reasons of state, to take what are from an individual moral point of view unacceptable decisions. However, no individual can invoke reasons of state for his or her individual decision. So there we come into, the question now is, if we have, for example, a person like Chernyakov, or we have Rumkowski, you can say that Rumkowski could have invoked in his September speech, when he asked the people to give their children to him so that that ghetto would continue to exist, that he could invoke as a leader of that community reasons of state to do so, and that he should not be judged as an individual. Yeah. And so this is, of course, and of course it's very difficult to start applying these kind of what seems to be abstract, moral, philosophical kind of categories to decisions that are so deeply wrenching in their implications in the individual lives of people. But I would argue that one of the reasons that I feel sympathetic to Pincus, when Pincus talks about that policeman, the question is, does this policeman at the Umschlagplatz, is he acting here now as a policeman or as a sadist at a certain moment? As a policeman, there is a range of things which he must do for reasons of state. But maybe that he goes, or probably he goes over the edge there. But you have to be able to make the distinction that he had both an office to fulfill, and he also as an individual is faced with decisions he made as an individual, outside of in some way the boundaries of the job he had been given by the Jewish Council.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to questions from folks out here. Let's start over here.
I have here my uncle's memoirs, Abraham Elsass. He was born in 1910 in Berkelo in Holland. He wrote these memoirs in the 1980s. He died in 1991. He was, I'll read to you here. This was referring to August of 1942, where he was part of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council. And this has to do with what they knew or what they didn't know and how it reflects to what you were talking about before. So he says here, meanwhile, the activities of the Jewish Council were on the increase. It was functioning in every town, even a minimal Jewish population, and its main aim was to maintain contact between the Jews and German occupation forces. I'm not going to read everything here. He decided to offer services because members of the council would be exempt from deportation for the time being and would only leave on the last train. Contradicting rumors had reached us, namely that conditions in the work camps in East Europe were very harsh and that many people were dying from hard labor. And he's writing this in the 1980s. Little did we know that what really happened and that extermination was in full swing. So a lot of these councils were not, they didn't know that people were being killed. They were under the impression that people were just being sent off. So they didn't realize they were sending people to die. And a lot of the judgment, I think, that's being placed on them is that what we know now, they didn't know then. So how does that impact our judgment today, trying to put ourselves, looking at the viewpoint, when they were in 1941, 42, they didn't know what we know now. And that, like you said before, the Germans were slowly, more like an erosion process. People didn't know. People couldn't envision that this was going to happen. So I'd just like your comments on that. If you want a copy of this, I can give that to you.
Shall I? Or you take?
Both of you.
Let me just talk about the particular case of this Jewish Council. It was the Jewish Council in the Netherlands was basically one.
This was an answer.
Yeah, there was over the whole country.
Yeah.
We ran the whole country. There is in October 1942, so deportation starts in July. The first train from Holland arrives in Auschwitz on the 17th of July. 1942, selection is taken and 1/3 of the transport, actually 2 trains, that's 1 transport, 1/3, 2,000 people, and some 600 people are killed, and the others are admitted to the camp. There are, by October 1942, some 30,000 people have been deported from Amsterdam already to Auschwitz, and then the first letter arrives. And this is a letter that talks about somebody has died in Auschwitz. This is the first thing that comes back. And the Jewish Council now has an extraordinary meeting in Amsterdam to analyze this letter. What does this mean? Of what did this person die? A single person. Yeah? So, yes, they were completely in the dark. I mean, they knew that Poland wasn't good. To go to Poland was not good. But they were clueless, and they remained clueless. The Jewish Council remained clueless until probably mid-1943. Now, till we take the other case, and that again we have to look at local conditions. In December 1941, 20,000 German Jews and Austrian Jews and Czech Jews arrive in Łódź, the Lodz ghetto, Litzmannstadt ghetto. Runkowski is told that he needs to make place for these Jews by deporting 20,000 Polish Jews. So the Höhere SS and Polizeiführer, the chief of the SS in the Warthegau, which is the province, gives a captain of the Sicherheitspolizei the job to create an extermination camp, extermination facility more, in Kelno or Kulmhof. By the first transport from Łódź leaves on the 3rd of January 1942. By March 1942, and these transports continue, by March 1942, Runkowski knows what's happening there. Now, then of course the question is, what does Runkowski do about it once he knows this? And of course he doesn't do anything. He in fact puts now all the German Jews who cannot work on the train to Kelno. So yes, I mean, can we judge Runkowski in January or February 1942 when he puts these useless eaters on the train? I mean, he knows it's not going to be very good, but okay, he may believe the German story, but what happens is that when clothing is coming back from Kelno into the Łódź ghetto to be sorted, and it's clear there's blood on it and whatever like that, no trace of these people, and they've heard what happened to the other communities, after that he knows, so then he should be, held responsible in a different way. Yeah, I mean, the situation for the Jewish councils changed from day to day also. And certainly, and this is generally in the analysis of Jewish councils, what most historians do. They make an immense distinction between the responsibility and culpability of Jewish councils before the killing actually starts and once the killings or the deportations start. And they see them as two different cases. Generally, of course, but what happened before the deportation started, Jewish councils, they list the people, they provide demographic and particular information to the Germans. All of that preparatory work is done by the Jewish council. They hand out the stars, whatever like that. They basically build for themselves the trap, which then the Germans only have to close. But they don't know what's going to happen. So this is very different from once they start to know that the train actually ends up in Auschwitz and there's a selection. But that takes time, and mostly then it's also too late.
Okay. The question is, how did one become a member of the Jewish Council or a chairman of the Jewish Council? Was it by appointment, by election, or volunteerism? It's not clear to me, and I think there are different scenarios perhaps.
Well, I mean, basically what actually happened is that there were existing Jewish community councils before, and very often, for example, like in Warsaw, I think they got together the first one, and then they took some of them and got rid of them, and then they appointed Runkowski as the chair. And in the beginning, the first council, if I remember correctly, was very well respected. It was made up of notables. One of the problems that they couldn't find kind of very nice people is because a lot of the leaders of the Jewish community in Warsaw had run away and went overseas. As soon as the war started, they went to Hungary, or I can't remember exactly. I mean, this is something not that I knew then, it's something that I've read afterward. They actually disappeared from, so the dearth of leaders and they appointed all kinds of people to the council. But basically it was the Germans decided who was going to serve on the council or not. They allowed Runkowski to bring in people, but it was, and that's basically it was. It was a haphazard way of doing it. So I don't think it was exactly something that you could say, this is how it was done or that's how it was done. It was done differently in all kinds of places.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the Jewish councils were generally established at the municipal level. That means that the local mayor, German mayor, whatever like that, or the local chief of police established the Jewish council. And when they got rid of it, I mean, Pinchas said they got rid of it, means they got shot. Yeah, they got killed. Now, in the discussion, there is, of course, to make things even more complex and more confusing, you have Jewish councils that work on the local level, the Council of Łódź, the Council of Warsaw, the Council of whatever city, which then the local important people generally being part of it until they get shot, and then some kind of upstart might come in. But then you also have, of course, these national Vereinigungen, the Reichsvereinigung für Juden in Germany. That means it's a national organization. In Germany, you didn't have local Jewish councils, but the Nazis established a national organization, which was run by a very famous rabbi, Leo Beck, and a couple of others. And they had very different dynamics, because they also do not deal now with the kind of chaos that happens on the municipal level and all kind of different rules, but they deal actually with national authorities. And so the same, for example, what happens in Austria. I mean, when we have Murmelstein is very interesting, because before he is the elder of the Jews and a member of the Jewish Council in Theresienstadt, he was very important in the leadership of the. He was the number 2 man or the number 3 man in the Vienna. Basically, the society, the community,
working as henchman for Eichmann.
Yeah, so there was the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, the Israelite cultic, religious community. It still exists, and it existed up to 1943. So there was never a Jewish council, but that pre-war Jewish community morphed into something that started to look like a Jewish council, act like a Jewish council in 1938 when the Nazis marched in. And so but there's a total historical continuity. It was the same chairman, and so it's almost invisible to actually see. It's not just imposed there, and it is so again, it's a very different kind of picture. So everything is unique in a sense.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was especially glad to hear that German Nazi differently treated Polish and Jewish people. May I assume, on the basis of the statements, that if the German army, Wehrmacht, were more successful on the Eastern Front, the Jewish fate would be different?
I didn't quite understand.
So the question is, if the German Wehrmacht had been more successful on the Eastern Front, as I presume is the fall of 1941, if the Holocaust would have gone differently, or it would not have happened. I'm willing to tackle that.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so there are debates, of course. When does the Holocaust become the Holocaust? Yeah. When does a policy of persecution turn into a genocide/Holocaust? And everyone agrees that it is somewhere between August 1941 and, let's say, March 1942, and then you can basically look at different emphasis. Now, there are there are many different theories about what happened, but there are two competing visions that are directly competing. The first one is that said that the Nazis started killing Jews because they were frustrated in their advance on Moscow. And the second one is they started killing Jews because they were on a high, because they were so excited about how well it went. See, this is the whole problem of historical evidence. You can argue both cases. Yeah? And you can actually argue both cases even simultaneously, say they were both frustrated and on a high. Now, I think that this would be really the subject for a whole conference. But if you look at evidence and if you look at the preparations that were taken, so we're not looking actually at what's actually happening, but the way things were prepared before the killings actually happened. We go back to basically May 1941 with the creation of the so-called Einsatzgruppen. The question is, who are they going to kill? And if you look then on a micro scale, you see actually that the killings of Russian Jews start at a time that things are going very well for the Germans, which would mean that if the Germans had won the war, probably it would have also meant the end of Jews elsewhere. But then we need to get a whole discussion about why the Germans were really out to kill the Jews or to get rid of the Jewish problem, which is not exactly the same thing. My judgment is that if they had conquered Russia, probably the Holocaust would have looked differently. I think that West European and Central European Jewry would have been deported to Russia, and they would have died there, because there would have been nothing there to receive them. So I think it would have ended up with the end of European Jewry, but probably the Germans would not have needed to use Auschwitz and these kind of particular killing installations that are unique to the Holocaust.
Thank you very much.
I'm interested in that.
Would you like the microphone?
I don't know, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm interested in the whole issue that you've approached about Hannah Arendt and the way things were viewed and reviewed and so on. It seems like it was inevitable that the Jewish councils would be brought into the organization of the ghettos because the Nazis wanted it that way, and they particularly organized it that way and made use of what was there. If you step back from the question of whether it was good or it was bad, and you take for granted that people are kind of doing the best that they can given the situations and so on, it seems to me that there is a possibility that something that Hannah Arendt was saying, if it's not looked at as just a negative, that she's sort of pointing fingers and saying, you know, these were bad people and did bad things, and if they hadn't been there, it would have been better for European Jewry. Is there a possibility that if the Nazis had, for example, just put people in ghettos, put people in camps, but not made any kind of use of the already existing organizations as those kind of boundaries, is it possible that there would have been a different kind of outcome, as Hannah Arendt was suggesting, that there would have been more chaos, and that there would have been different kinds of outcomes? Am I making myself clear?
Well, it's sort of like asking to prove a negative. I'm not sure we can ever really know that.
Everything is possible, but is it plausible, which would be in some way the more important question. I don't think that, I mean, I think we might, there is, I was educated in England, did my PhD at Warwick Institute, and my doctor father was Dame Francis Yates, always said that as a historian you always have to for a moment open the door for an alternative history. Mm-hmm. Yeah? That you always, in order to judge what happened, you have to for a moment to look what didn't happen, what might have happened, in order to judge what happened. But you also, but you know, you open that door, but the question is, does it mean now that we're going to write alternative history? In this case, I think that that certainly what Hannah Arendt did, I mean, she raised a very interesting question. I do not believe she was right as a historian. Yeah, she raised it as a political scientist, yeah, which is also a political philosopher. Now, political philosophers make very bad historians, generally, yeah? And the reason is, of course, that a philosopher always starts with the general, yeah? And a historian always starts with the particular, which is always the exception. Yeah, that is where, as a historian, you always struggle with that doesn't fit the story. That's where you start working. That's where history is done. And so, in a sense, I think it's very difficult when a philosopher actually starts to make a judgment on history. So that's where, if I may just slip out of that.
I mean, sorry, there are lots of questions. I think you answered them now. Just ask your questions.
Oh, I'd be interested in hearing your answer.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
sure
too.
everybody else would too.
No, basically the way I feel about it is as follows. It's not a question of supposition. It's not a question of if would happen. The Nazis came and organize themselves exactly the way they wanted. They had a system and they had a way of doing things which they worked out quite a long time before. For example, I mean, the Belgians and Gelderland, my grandfather, who was in the Łódź ghetto, because we come from Łódź, and I found out that he was on the first list of the Judenrat, because all the records from Łódź, from the Judenrat, exist. They were not destroyed. The Germans didn't have enough, the Nazis didn't have time enough to destroy them. So his name is on the first list of the first train that went to Chelmno at the age of approximately 80, something like that. And that was towards the end of 1941, beginning of 42, something like that. So it wasn't a question that they weren't going to kill all the Jews. It wasn't a question that they weren't going to put up Judenrat. It was something that they have worked for a long time, and there was no way of kind of thinking in terms that they weren't going to do it, and if they didn't do it, could we have done that? It's just not possible even to speculate on that, in my mind, because if you were there, then you would have realized that that was just, there were no options, because whatever they wanted, they did. I mean, in 1940, before the ghetto, before anything, any Nazi could stop a Jew in Warsaw and shoot him, and nothing would be done to him. And they did it. They did it in Łódź, and they did it. As soon as they came in the first weeks of, there was a cafe, a special cafe where a lot of Jewish intelligentsia used to come. The SS drove up with a motor car. They took everybody out while they were having coffee. They took them to the Gestapo headquarters, and they murdered them all. And this was 1939, just soon after the war was finished. They did something else. When they came, when the war started, and it wasn't even the SS. They found a troop of Polish Boy Scouts who weren't Jewish, who were Catholics. They stood them against the wall in their uniform, the little boys, and they murdered them all. They shot them with machine guns. So it's not a question of, you know, we could have done this, or you could have done that, or you could have done something else. And it's all very well, you know, after that, you know, especially Hannah Arendt to come with that, you know, that this and that was guilty and that was guilty. I don't think that we can make suppositions or even think about these philosophical answers to something which has no answer.
I think we can take one more over here.
No, we can take another one.
Sorry, my question is, because we know during the Holocaust, the Germans also targeted other, I would say, ethnic, like the Roma and different sort of people also. Did they also use those kind of councils with them, or was that just something very particular to the Jewish people?
If I just may answer.
No, I mean, in Poland, the municipalities worked originally. In Warsaw, you had the mayor, they had a mayor, and they had the Polish police. They actually set up, just like in other places, they used the existing organs of, and they had, in Polish it's called the little towns, it's called the starosta, you know, the elder of they actually used these councils, but in a different way, of course.
But that's just for the Roma and Sinti, of course there is a social organization, they have the so-called kings. Yeah.
Right.
But it's very, I mean, the whole pattern of persecution is very different to start with. That is, that there were no kind of gypsy Zigeuner councils set up, these old Zigeuner Räte set up. There was really no elite there to work with. But also the big difference between the persecution of the Roma Sinti and the genocide of the Roma Sinti is that it never moved beyond being a police action. That in a sense, that as policy-wise, that the persecution and ultimately genocide of the Jews acquired in the German general administration a large significance.
No Wannsee for...
There's no Wannsee for the Roma Sinti. There is, so basically it is mostly dealt with at the level, there's no gypsy question. Yeah? Zigeunerfrage doesn't exist. It was never part of propaganda, there are no posters, there are no movies. It is basically one of public hygiene in some way, in the sense that it remains at the level of police actions taken at local levels, and then it's some way farmed out ultimately by sending Roma Sinti 20,000, 25,000 to Auschwitz. But so it's a very different story in that sense. And also the other groups that are persecuted are not basically in some way burdened with this history of this unique question of collaboration.
There's this lady here, you've been asked.
Thank you for doing that. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody on the panel. I heard things I've never heard before. Very clearly, and with the kind of details I really like. So, my first question to Robert
Yes.
is similar to that question, but slightly different in that you said it was unique the way, or very unusual for, usually you go in and you kill off all the elite, which makes sense, so there's no one to organize. And I was wondering if you had any idea why, in this case, the Germans didn't do what you'd expect them to do, which is kill off the Jewish elite, but instead have the council. And secondly, my question to Pinchas is, a lot of what you said was very interesting. I was wondering how much was what you remember at the time as a 10, 11, 12-year-old child, and how much was information you learned afterwards? Like, for example, the head of that hospital, the Jewish police at the hospital, who checked everybody when they went out to make sure they were a real doctor and nurse, not a Jew trying to escape. How much was what you knew from the time, and how much was what you learned afterwards?
This particular, you know, he wasn't a doctor. This was a policeman, and he was in charge of the Umschlagplatz, which is the place where all the people were concentrated before deportation. And we knew about him, how terrible he was. And eventually, he was actually, you know, executed by the Jewish resistance, by the, you know, the ones that actually had the uprising afterwards, but he was killed beforehand because of his, so I knew about that at the time. There are other things, for example, I'm not quite sure exactly what, that I've learned after the war, but it wasn't something that I wasn't aware, in other words, it was happening to me, but I may not have been exactly aware of it at that particular time. But the moment I learned about it, it became familiar to me because I experienced it. So, you know, it's both.
Shall I take the other?
Yeah.
So the other question, the Germans had experience. So what happened in '33 when the Nazis come to power? They basically what happens is that either they empower or the Jewish community leadership empowers itself in Germany to start to try to find a response and a solution to whatever problem there is. So the most important is, of course, that from 1935 onwards, the Jewish community is de facto isolated in Germany because of the Nuremberg laws. Yeah? They're now pushed out of the body politic of the nation. They're still there. And what happens is that the community is thrown back on itself and starts basically organizing the most important response, which is emigration. Now, emigration is now, it is still individual, but the community starts to help people to find places, to help people to find visas. In 1938, the next step is taken in Vienna, when individual immigration, when Eichmann comes in with the German army, and Eichmann goes to Mermelstein, yeah? I mean, he's the guy now who is going to be in charge of making individual immigration into collective immigration. Yeah? So now basically they create a whole system, which is then the next step is deportation. Yeah? Now, in all of this, the Jewish community takes leadership. The Jewish community basically takes on responsibilities which it never had done before in the history of Jewish communities. So the Germans, by 1939, when they march into Poland, they actually have, to a certain level, already experience with an empowered Jewish elite in the Old Reich, the Altreich, Germany itself, and in a much greater measure in Austria in 1938. And this is where Mermelstein actually becomes very important. What I found very interesting in the movie, and I really would say go all to DVD, the video store and get it or buy the DVD. Everyone talks, I mean, he talks about what he did in Theresienstadt. And he there was the third elder of the Jews, as if that's the most important thing. Of course, he's the only elder of the Jews who survived, and in that sense he's interesting. But for a historian, it's much more interesting actually what he did in Vienna. Because in Vienna, what you see him actually is that he goes in as one kind of official in the Jewish community in 1938, and he is an ordinary official, like we have in Toronto officials in the Jewish community. You know, he has a salary, he is, you know, it is a job for him, and seems to be an ordinary job. You know, he was a rabbi somewhere, but he couldn't be a rabbi anymore. It was also, you know, he got an increase in salary. He thought he could do something good there, helping people who wanted to leave to find ways to leave. And then that position morphs into one by which in 1941 he is a collaborator with Eichmann. To organize deportations. In already 1939, he organizes the first deportations to Nisko. Yeah? And he goes to the Nisko, near Lublin, the reservation as it's called, to look how things are going there. So it's that period, of course, in history, when something has its final form. For a historian, that's not so interesting anymore. What we're interested in is how something develops. And that's why we're interested in, you know, in youth, because they are developing. And in some way, that is where I think the importance of the movie is, because in some way, he explains it, and also what makes it so interesting in the movie is that when we go to what happens in Theresienstadt, he is kind of defensive. He argues like a lawyer, trying to defend himself, because what happens in Theresienstadt, the trains are going to Auschwitz, yeah, so to speak. That is some way unforgivable. There we have an absolute situation of where he in some way has to make really, let's call it evil decisions. But when he is in Vienna, I mean, he probably saved 102,000 Jewish lives. I mean, he was responsible for the emigration of 102,000 Viennese Jews, who therefore were able to save their lives.
Well, I should add though, and this all for me comes full circle as a journalist covering this particular event. After my story came out in the New York Times about Lanzmann and Mermelstein, I had a correspondent who was inflamed about this, very, very, very upset about the notion that there should be any forgiveness for Mermelstein. He said in Vienna, it was Mermelstein and his thugs who were at the train station taking the luggage away from the people about to be transported to go through the luggage for any valuables, and anybody who showed any resistance was beaten up.
When?
Well, this was before Therese, obviously before Theresienstadt, so, and it's after Kristallnacht, so it's for him the line before and after, it's all about Kristallnacht.
But you know, I would argue as a historian, I think that, you know, as a historian you need to get the chronology right, and I think Mermelstein in early 1939 is a different guy than Mermelstein in October 1939 when he organizes the first deportation to Nisko, and he's a different guy in early 1941 when it's still possible to leave German-occupied or German-ruled Europe to the United States via Portugal. And it's a different thing than in late 42 when the trains go to Auschwitz. And I think that each time you have again to look at a particular situation. So I would argue with this, your correspondent, that, you know, I would be, if Mermelstein did that in 1939, it's a very different situation for Mermelstein, if this is true.
Well,
than doing this in 1942, and I would be prepared to be Mermelstein lawyer at that moment.
Well, I will end with a story of my final exchange with Lanzmann on the subject after I've spoken to Pinchas, and Pinchas has said to me, as far as I'm concerned, Lanzmann does not do justice to the history of the Judenrat. He went off the rails. I cannot understand how he could have been sold a bill of goods by Mermelstein, who was collaborating for his own purposes. Ideology doesn't come into it. They were collaborators. And I say in the piece, when I repeated this to Lanzmann, this is on We've done an extensive interview in New York, and now I'm speaking with him on the phone from Paris. I said, when I repeated this to Landsman, he became angry. It was not collaboration, definitely not, he said. He had no choice. They were absolutely forced. And what he says is very, very, and there's a long pause on the phone line, he's talking about Mermelstein, and what he says is very, very sad. Thank you all.